Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Raw podcast, brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. I'm Phil Smith, joined as ever by my colleague Jason Jones. Jason, when we spoke last week, Jobe Bellingham had decided he wanted to go to Borussia Dortmund, so we kind of knew that it was probably going to happen at some point. It has since happened for a fee around the region of 30 million quid, with the sell-on included. What's your initial kind of reaction a day on from Bellingham's exit being confirmed?
Yeah, it's a weird one, this, isn't it? Because I kind of feel that it's been so long in the offing and it became such an inevitability that I almost like steeled myself against it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not necessarily as gutted by this as I would have expected myself to be. I think that obviously, from a footballing point of view, it's going to be a big loss to Sunderland. We know how pivotal he was in that promotion campaign. We've seen how much he's grown and matured and the trajectory that he's been on over these past 2 years. So obviously, it's a big vacuum that Sunderland are going to have to fill in the middle of the park. From a business standpoint, I think Sunderland have done a really good job, to be perfectly honest with you. Obviously, we've spoken so much about the model and how this is arguably one of the best illustrations of it in practice and how successful it can be when you think about how much Jobe came in for, you think about how much he's contributed to the side over the course of his time at the club, and then you think about the fact that he's leaving for a club record fee, or what should become a club record fee with add-ons, and the whole Jordan Pickford was around that mark, wasn't he? But it will probably end up eclipsing that. And so in that sense, I think that Sunderland really have to be commended, that they dug their heels in. They made it clear that they wanted a little bit more money than Dortmund were initially stumping up. But they've held the ground. They've done really well. And I think that from the player's point of view, it feels like a good next step in his career. We've all seen how talented he is. We know that there's the association between the Bellingham family and Dortmund as a club. And it does feel as if it's maybe one of those deals, and quite a rare thing in football, but where all parties kind of come out of it feeling like they're in a good place at the other side of it.
It's an interesting one, isn't it, in terms of the way it's developed, because it could leave you feeling a little bit cold. I think that, it's all felt very pre-planned or very mapped out, kind of Jobe. If we're brutally honest, Sunderland have been a stepping stone here, really, haven't they? And I guess the return on that is the significant profit that they've made. But I guess that it's, to Jobe's credit, it doesn't necessarily feel like that because of the level of performance and the level of commitment he's put in, particularly this season. And I guess particularly because obviously he had the chance to kind of leave, or at least push to leave last summer, and he decided not to do it. So it feels like it says a lot about him, that a deal that might leave you feeling a little bit cold about modern football, I think actually it doesn't really seem to feel like that, and the reaction of the fans has obviously been very different on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Full credit to the lad. His commitment has never ever wavered. You could tell how much that he was so desperate, wasn't he, to see Sunderland over the line. He saw his reaction after the playoff final, but even the way that he's applied himself throughout the course of this season in particular, there's never been any doubt with Jobe Bellingham, despite the noise that's been going on for so long now in some of the really illustrious clubs that have been linked with him, such as Dortmund. He's never ever looked anything less than 100% committed. It's interesting what you say about Sunderland being a stepping stone in this scenario, but I think the key there, isn't it, that at the time when Sunderland brought Bellingham in, that was kind of like their USP in a lot of respects, wasn't it? Come in here, you will get game time, we trust in you, and we can give you the platform to go and sort of springboard yourself onto a bigger club. I don't necessarily think that that's any sort of indictment of Sunderland's status or anything. It's just a matter of fact that, it was something they were able to offer Bellingham, that next step in his career, in the same way that, I'm sure that on some level he'll probably be hoping that Dortmund is another step. We've seen his brother go to Real Madrid. He'll obviously back himself to do really special things as well. And, like I say, it's been it's been a period that has really benefited Sunderland, that has obviously really benefited Bellingham. And while it is disappointing to see him leave, I do think that ultimately it's one that everybody will look back on fondly.
I think my feeling about this at the moment is a little bit not really realistic, probably to stand in Bellingham's way once he's decided he wants to go to Dortmund, Champions League football, all of that. Can't really argue with the deal that's been done. When you look at the kind of fees that have been spent this summer, what kind of gets spent on players of his age and his potential, I think it's all fair enough. But do have this little worry that when you step up, I think, from the Championship to the Premier League, you accept that not every one of your players is going to be able to handle that step up. Bellingham was one of the few who you felt fairly comfortable was going to be able to do that. And I do feel like this leaves a huge hole in Sunderland's midfield going into next season, because although Sunderland are blessed with very, very talented midfielders, and I've no doubt that they have midfielders who can step up to the level, Jobe was a little bit unique in the way he played and what he brought. It makes me nervous that Sunderland have gone into the start of the window being weakened by the loss of one of their key players, when we all know that they have to strengthen considerably if they're going to compete next year.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very valid point. The Jobe's maturity, and the thing that always impressed me was the way that he'd be able to protect the ball, his use of possession. He was so economical in that. He was so wonderful at maintaining Sunderland's grip on a game in the middle of the park. And players like that don't come along all that often. But players like that who are at the age that he's at, they're like gold dust, aren't they? They just very, very rarely exist, and that's why Dortmund have obviously been so willing to pay so much money for him. I think that because of that as well, as you sort of alluded to, he's quite a unique profile of player, and it's going to be difficult to find a one-for-one replacement for Jobe Bellingham. And I think we're seeing that already. If you look at some of the names that have been thrown about and how much sort of weight there is behind them is a matter of debate. But when you look at a player like like Charlie Gray, who's been mentioned, Manchester City youth prospect. Now, in a lot of respects, archetypal Sunderland signing, player who isn't necessarily getting game time for City, who's wanting to test himself at the first team level. By all accounts, a very, very talented young player, but also not a Jobe Bellingham. He prefers to sit deep, he prefers to distribute. And so you sort of wonder whether Sunderland will look to go out and sign Bellingham Mark II. And if they do, how much that's going to cost them, how difficult that's going to be for them. Or are they going to maybe try and sort of recreate him in the aggregate, if you like? It's going to be a really interesting one to see in terms of their recruitment strategy.
I think where that balance of the midfield is going to be really interesting, because, as I said, there's no doubt about the quality in midfield in this group. Like Enzo Lefebvre is clearly Premier League quality. Chris Rigg, I think, he'll need a little bit of adjustment time, but he's clearly going to be a Premier League player. Dan Neil, I think, absolutely has the potential to be a Premier League player. But is that a Premier League midfield three? And is it a Premier League midfield three straight away for a team going up into the Premier League that's potentially going to have 25, 30% possession a lot of weeks? I think that's probably the thing that makes me a bit worried about Bellingham is not just the quality that you're losing, but I feel like it upsets the blend of Sunderland's midfield. And I think we saw that last year, because I don't think Sunderland won a game in the games where Bellingham was suspended, did they, or injured. And I don't think that's a coincidence. As I say, I think the quality is there, but even if it's not directly replacing Bellingham, they're going to have to add something a little bit different to this group, aren't they? Not just in centre midfield, probably in defence as well. I think the pace and power is what worries me about this step up, and I think that's something that Sunderland are going to have to add a lot of in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And it's so hard to know, isn't it? I think the one thing I would say, and the one thing that sort of gives me a little bit of heart and a little bit of cause for optimism, is that there have been misfires under Christian Speakman. Of course, there have. It's why Nazari Rusin is currently out in Croatia, and Timothy Pembele went over to France, and all those sort of things. And discussed them at length. But by and large, the recruitment has been good, which is why Sunderland are now back in the Premier League. And on top of that as well, we haven't really seen what Sunderland can do with a decent amount of money in the back pocket. And so the fee that they brought in for Bellingham encourages me, because it makes me think that it will allow Sunderland potentially and presumably to go and operate in maybe a higher tier of market that they haven't been able to already, and that could therefore open up the possibility of them bringing in targets that we haven't really been able to consider up until this point. But absolutely, you're right. There's no getting away from the fact that losing Bellingham is a huge blow in a footballing sense. And I think you're absolutely right as well, where you look at him and you go, yeah, he probably could have made that step up and not really brought in a sweat. And I think that's why it's so intriguing to see how well he performs over in the Bundesliga, because he does feel as if he's ready to take that next step and really try his hand at a sort of top level of football.
Well, good luck to him, and good luck to him in the Club World Cup. I can't say I'll be rushing out to buy a subscription for that tournament, to be honest, because I still don't really understand why it's happening or who's playing in it. But since we last spoke, we've obviously heard from the sporting director, Christian Speakman, as well, who, as you would expect, quite coy in a lot of ways, certainly in terms of individuals, but gave us, I think, a little bit of a flavour of how Sunderland are looking to approach this window, very much stressing that the focus is going to be on quality over quantity, that Sunderland want to run quite a small squad again next year. I think it's fair for us to deduce that they're focusing primarily on a few higher quality additions rather than overhauling the squad. What was your kind of feeling sort of reading those comments, and what's your kind of feeling about how Sunderland will go about it this summer?
Yeah, I think that my gut sort of tells me that there won't be a complete sort of abandonment of the blueprint. You know what I mean? I think that the way that Sunderland have operated, this trusting in youth, buying players who are going to develop, who are going to kick on and sort of carry the club along with them on that pathway, I still think Sunderland will look to do that. I just think that, or at least you would hope that they will be able to do it at a higher level than they have been able to thus far. I do also fully believe that they will be looking to bring in, the odd experienced head here and there. Obviously, the Jordan Henderson things will not go away, and I think they'll probably rumble on all summer until he finds a club, whether that is Sunderland or whether it's elsewhere. But even just, some of the other names that we've seen mentioned in terms of fullback cover, and again, it's difficult to know how much credence there is in this, but when you see in names like Harry Toffolo, who's been at Forest, he's been around the block, you see names like Vladimir Koufal, who's just been released by West Ham, like those sort of signings, while not necessarily those players specifically, I think those sort of signings for Sunderland wouldn't necessarily go amiss. I think that bringing in a few players who know the league, who are sort of well versed in the division and who are able to just offer something a little bit different, not just on the pitch, but certainly in terms of the dressing room as well. I think that's vital. Sunderland are they're almost quite uniquely placed in the sense that there aren't many clubs who've come up in recent seasons who are so lacking in Premier League experience. I mean, off the top of my head, and I could be completely wrong here, but I'm struggling to think of it. Obviously, Chris Mebham's gone now, isn't he? He's gone back to Bournemouth. So you take him out and you're like, well, how many of these players have actually played in the top flight? And not many, if any. And so I think for that reason, Sunderland will surely have to go and look to bring in at least a couple of players who've played in the division before, Phil, surely.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because also, you're kind of watching the Premier League rumour mill pick up pace and stuff. And although I do think Sunderland will add a bit of Premier League experience, you have a wry smile when you read links with players in their mid-20s knocking on 30 and Sunderland getting linked with paying X million and this in wages. And you think, yeah, you really need to read up on how Sunderland have changed in the last 8 years since they're at this level, because that just ain't happening. I think it's a really interesting debate for me, because at every point of this kind of project and step, we've kind of gone, yeah, but you can't do it again. You can't just keep doing this. Yeah. And I kind of find myself saying that a little bit again now going into the Premier League, just because I think the scale of the jump from the Championship to the Premier League is so massive. But it's interesting that my personal feeling, I don't know what you think, is I'm less interested in Premier League experience. I'm more interested in top tier experience. I'm not necessarily obsessed with the idea that you need players who've played at the Premier League before, but what I'm hoping to see from the bulk of Sunderland's recruits is a little bit of a track record of doing it at the top level. If that's in a European league, if it's in someone who's played quite a bit in the French top division or anything like that. I think for me, it's more about players who have experience in the sort of tactical and the intensity of the top level, if that makes sense. And that's why I do think there's going to have to be a bit of a shift this summer. I don't think you can throw in too many players who've never played senior football before at Premier League level. I mean, what's your kind of feeling on it? But I'm less interested in how many Premier League games they played, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think that is a fair point. For me personally, I think that we're constantly told, aren't we, how unique the Premier League is, the challenges that it sort of that it presents, and for that reason, I'd like to see maybe one or two. Like, and again, it's all about the right profile of player, isn't it? I've got no real interest in Sunderland bringing in players who yo-yoed between the Premier League and the Championship for the past few years, or whatever it may be. That being said, I think you're absolutely right. It doesn't. Not every single one of them, for my money, has to be a player who's played in the Premier League before. And I think that what we've seen is that, and we've seen it at Sunderland as well, you know, when you think about how well Regis Lebris sort of adapted to the English game, how quickly he was able to do that, admittedly at the Championship level, not in the Premier League, but English game at large. Enzo Lefebvre came in, made an impact. There have been others besides Wilson Isidore. You know, it does show that quality is quality across the board. And you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily a prerequisite that these players have to have played in England before. They just have to be good players who will offer something on the pitch, and also just maybe a little bit of sort of solidity in the dressing room as well. That being said, I think that, you know, because of the just absolute lack of Premier League experience in Sunderland's squad at the moment, I'd probably feel a little bit more comforted if there were at least one or two who were brought through the door to just sort of, you know, address that a little bit.
I think one of the key things about this as well is get your thoughts on this. What's incredibly clear, reading between the lines of what Christian Speakman was saying, was that what they want to avoid is being saddled with big contracts and deals that don't make sense if the worst comes to the worst. And unfortunately, you have to consider the very, very realistic prospect that you will get relegated at the end of next season, because that's what's happened to the last 6 teams that have gone up. I mean, it's very clear that we're not going to see I guess the kind of the pin-up of it is the Nottingham Forest style transfer splurge, you know, where I can't remember how many players they signed, but it was well into double figures, wasn't it, when they got promoted? Obviously worked for them, but the risks, of course, if it hadn't quite worked, were huge. Are you kind of comfortable with someone's position on this, which is we're going to have a good goal, we're going to invest, we're going to try and stay up, but we're also going to have the bigger picture in mind that if we fall short, we'll then hopefully be in a very, very strong position to go back into the Championship and try and re-establish ourselves back to the Premier League a second time round, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd say about this is that you've kind of just got to put your faith in the ownership and the recruitment plan that have served them so well this far. Like, you know, obviously there is a very real possibility that Sunderland will at the very least be in a relegation battle next season. I think we're all kind of expecting it to some extent, you know, and I think that if that is the case, then you obviously want the club to be in the best position possible in the event of them dropping back down to the Football League. I think that what Speakman and co and the ownership writ large, you know, have shown us that they're canny. Like, you know, they're quite smart in what they do. They're not necessarily going to break the habits that have brought them this far, and I don't think we are, like you say, going to go and see them splurge loads of money and bring in these big contracts and, you know, sort of book the trend that they've set for themselves. But I just think that, you know, it's going to be, we assume, a difficult season for Sunderland, but by getting up to the Premier League, the hope is that they have insured themselves for a little while to come. Obviously, it doesn't always work out like that. We saw Luton go down again this season. It can be really, really difficult. But the prize that Sunderland have now for being in the Premier League is that they put them themselves in a position where, if they are smart about their business from here on out, they can build, and whether that's at the top of the Championship or the lower tiers of the Premier League for the time being, only time will tell, but they're in a much stronger position than they were at the start of the season. And I think that, you know, a little bit of patience, a little bit of faith, you would hope that ultimately they will be able to really establish themselves one day further down the line, and hopefully next season. But we'll see, won't we?
Yeah, we're not going to go too deep into names today because we talked about Jordan Henderson last week. And I think at this stage of the window, I think it's such early days and there's so much spurious stuff flying around that I don't think it's worth anyone's time getting too bogged down in that. Before we finish, Jace, we're going to have a little bit of chat about season tickets. So season tickets, well, a limited number of them, because 30,000 of them had already been snapped up, have gone on general sale this morning. Huge demand. Thousands of people in the queue this morning online. Lots and lots and lots and lots of people, quite literally in the queue down at the Stadium of Light. Really interesting in terms of, I think we were all looking to see what Sunderland did in terms of prices now that Sunderland are up. And as we probably expected, there's a fairly significant kick. So it's £100 extra for the cheapest adult ticket if from the early bird phase if you're buying a new ticket, and it's £130 for the cheapest renewal price in the early bird. Just interested, first and foremost, before we have a little bit of a chat about this, about how you feel about where Sunderland have landed on this, and what your feeling is in terms of whether they've got this kind of right in terms of the prices that they've set.
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, you're probably in a better place to talk about this than I am, Phil. What I would say is that it's always going to be a bit of an inevitability, wasn't it, that Sunderland go up and the prices go up, you know. Again, I'll sort of bounce it back to you because I do feel like you're a better place to answer this. But I mean, that increase, I mean, how fair do you feel it is personally? Because like I say, it was always going to happen, wasn't it? There was always going to be some sort of increase. But I mean, do you think that's a fair increase? Do you think it's a little bit too much?
I think it's not far off being fair. I think that, you know, when you factor in the concessions and the fact that it's obviously considerably cheaper for younger fans and older fans to go, I think, you know, the cheapest new season ticket, I think, works out at about £31.40 per game, something like that, for an adult. I think that's a fair price for Premier League football. Do you? I think that's okay. I'm fairly comfortable with that. I think the interesting thing about it for me is that I think that I don't have an issue personally with what's gone out today in terms of, I think it's absolutely right that those who have had season tickets in the League One and Championship era are rewarded for that loyalty. And I think it's absolutely right that they get a considerable reduction as a result of that. I think that's absolutely bang on. I think, as you say, it was inevitable that now that you're playing for Premier League football, costs are going to go up. Whether we like it or not, Sunderland have to try and compete with clubs who are charging significantly more for tickets. And I don't think it's particularly unreasonable, as I say, to be looking at £30 a game. The thing that makes me a little bit nervous is the first thought is, well, if this is the baseline for Premier League season ticket prices, what about those people who've had season tickets for 10 years who are currently paying, you know, 20 odd quid a game? Is this a start of that being hiked? You know, and how, I guess the thing is, and you know, it's not necessarily for today, but the thing that makes me a little bit nervous is, where does that process start slow, if you like? Because you have to get the balance between exploiting, if you like, the commercial and the financial opportunities that being in the Premier League brings. That's how you compete. But I also think, you know, it's absolutely imperative as well that there's a recognition that, you know, you can't just keep lifting the prices over and over again. Hopefully we're talking about a long stint in the Premier League for Sunderland. But yeah, what's your kind of feelings?
Yeah, I think it's a concern, isn't it? You know, I got sent through like a press release this morning. I was having a glance over it. And if you look at like other clubs who've been in the Premier League, I think, you know, sort of a club like Aston Villa, for instance, and you know, they've had Champions League football and whatever, but since 2018, their season ticket prices have just sort of climbed exponentially, you know. And I think it's, you take a club like Fulham, the cost of their season tickets has gone up something like 100% over the course of however many years or something. Maybe not 100, but you know what I mean? It's a lot, and it is a concern. The other thing I would say as well is that like this is season tickets, and season tickets are going to work out, let's say, like, you know, £31 odd a game, whatever. Just a normal match going ticket as well. It's going to be interesting to see how much they are now, because I think last season they were something like 38 quid, give or take. You know, how much are they going to be bumped as well? So that's going to be an interesting one to find out in due course, I think.
Yeah, I think we can deduce there's going to be a significant spike from what we've seen today, can't we? I mean, I do think I'm not coming at it from a negative angle, because I think it's really important to stress that I think one of the things that Sunderland have done really, really well, and have even done so through some pretty bad ownership regimes, is the cost of watching football. I think it's always something for a long time that they've got right. And, you know, even thinking back to the end of last season around us in the press box, lots of games, wasn't there, where, you know, full of kids, where, you know, there was a real concerted effort to bring the next generation through and to make it accessible for them. So I think it's something that generally Sunderland deserve a lot of praise for. And I think at the moment, I'll do some more research on this, but they're clearly going to be one of the cheapest places to watch Premier League football next season, and that's commended. I just hope that that's something that stays the case when, you know, that we're on this journey, that that's something that we can still be talking about Sunderland has been good at in 3 or 4 years' time. But I guess we'll see on that one. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. So we'll be back next week, hopefully with some more substantive transfer discussions. We'll obviously have the fixtures coming out as well, which is going to be very, very exciting. So yeah, we'll reconvene and have a chat about that. But in the interim, there'll be absolutely stacks for you to read over on the Sunderland Echo website, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of video content here on YouTube as well. So Jace, thanks for your company, thanks for your chat, thanks everyone as ever for watching and listening. We'll be back with you super soon.